Secretariat, and obviously big appreciation for work of all colleagues, especially rapporteurs that make excellent work, and this is a very good base for preparation of the report that will be important in our effort. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Ludek.
Thank you very much, Ludek. With respect to the mandate, it's a little bit broader because we also have some tasks to do as a result of Taxe 1 and Taxe 2. We'll have to discuss that. And then self-regulation is a point from the fact-finding missions, in particular with Luxembourg, that showed that out of 300 lawyers, only one single case was actually checked. And, of course, that's cause for concern. But, of course, we're going to discuss that. Thank you very much for your position. I think that's a very good basis for cooperation. Our colleague from the ECR, Zambaski, is not here today, but there's no one speaking in their stead. Maybe he's on his way back from Cyprus. So now, on behalf of the GUI, Mr. Miguel Orban Crespo. There he is.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank the rapporteurs for presenting a document that I think is very interesting, mapping out of the issue, and I think it contains some good recommendations. Nevertheless, I think citizens are expecting much more from us. We have an opportunity to send a clear message about the usefulness of the Parliament, in particular after what happened last week in Strasbourg. I would like to recall a phrase from Victor Hugo. The future has many names. For the weak, it is the unreachable. For those who are afraid, it's the unknown, and for the brave, it's an opportunity. Today, colleagues, I think we need to be courageous. And we think that the document could go much further in what it's pursuing and tackling other outstanding issues that aren't in there. For example, tax avoidance and money laundering we consider to be economic terrorism. They underlie the financing of criminal activities, as well as lead to the deterioration of social rights and public policies, and they also erode the tax base of states. The general policy of the Union to have a framework for deregulated movement of capital and a lack of tax harmonization means that there's a continual tax devaluation and a lack of public development, lack of investment, which is actually what our citizens and the planet needs. It is inadmissible that in the European Economic Area there are countries included in it that are actually tax hideouts. The free ports that still exist in the European Union are the most extreme, scandalous form of this practice of tax dumping. All criminals from my country take our money to Andorra and Switzerland, and that's not a coincidence. These countries and many others fail to have a proper tax cooperation. They have much lower tax rates with respect to the average tax burden, and they use formulas which make it impossible to identify the beneficial owner. They therefore work on the basis of secrecy but don't use due diligence. We should therefore think about sanctions such as the temporary suspension of relations with these areas. For example, a moratorium of trade agreements and double tax agreements. The report shows the players involved. Nevertheless, it does partially fail to point the finger at the banks, because the banks are the linchpin of facilitation, promotion of tax avoidance and money laundering. We should actually be looking at the amount of capital managed rather than the number of offshore companies. We need to have the proper tax responsibility for the ultimate beneficiary. We need an international register of ultimate beneficiaries that makes no one be able to avoid it. The reports from Taxe 1 and Taxe 2, as well as the revision of the 4th Directive against money laundering, has made progress. However, we need to make more progress on sanctions. we should take note of the recommendations of various experts and the hearings of this committee, which talked about sanctions such as removal of the banking licence. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, language is not a neutral thing. It's necessary for us once and for all to talk about the enablers and to stop simply talking about intermediaries, as we see in the document. Furthermore, we consider that the criteria regarding the blacklist are unacceptable, in particular the list to the GAFI tax, reference to the GAFI tax force or the FATF. Cooperation in terms of the automatic exchange of information shouldn't be enough to stop being considered a risk country. We should also include countries that have lower tax rates than a certain threshold, and in particular European countries that do not comply with the criteria. Now, once again, I would like to thank you for the work you've done and the framework you've proposed. We will be tabling some amendments to try to include the changes we want to make and make sure that we have a document that allows us to actually take some step forwards in legislation to avoid this kind of thing that we consider fundamental and where we think we need to be courageous, particularly as that's what the people want from us. Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel Urban Crespo, for the GUI. If I may make one point, of course, tax rates are set by the member state. They're not governed by the treaties. I really don't think we will be able to set higher or lower amounts. There's a lot of resistance to that, but we do need to have fair taxation, and that's something we're going to continue to discuss in the rest of the year. Malta, for example, has a 35% corporate tax, but brings it down by 30 percentage points for foreigners. I don't consider that to be fair. Now, just a short point, and then I'll hand on to the next speaker. Chair, I know, but this report is not legislative. However, we think that we at least need to have arguments up our sleeve for the different countries in the Council and the different institutions to then be able to make legislation. This is an important subject for us. Okay, agree. Next, Mrs. Molly Scott-Cato for the Greens.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'd like to start by echoing what other colleagues have said about the really excellent and hard work done by rapporteurs, and perhaps we'll pat ourselves on the back a little bit as well, and thank the Secretariat for all their work. So on the process, we support the idea of having these three documents, one on our activities and one on the findings and one on recommendations. While this does tend to lead to some redundancies, especially in the part of the recommendations, this is a good basis to build from, we believe. The overview of activities documents should contain our mission reports and links to summary of our different sessions. We need to think of future readers in a few months or a few years who will be interested in the work of the PANA committee, and we need to make sure that they have all the information they need to judge what we did. On the content, we support the main findings of the co-rapporteurs on tax evasion and avoidance, on money laundering, on intermediaries, and on the other points that they raised. We generally support the conclusions that there is a lack of an adequate legislative framework and insufficient implementation by Member States, and insufficient enforcement and supervision by the Commission, as well as the finding of breach of the duty of sincere cooperation by Member States as regards their collaboration with our Panama Committee. We note that the co-rapporteurs concluded there was no breach of EU law on the implementation of the Directive on Administrative Cooperation with regard to tax and the third Anti-Money Laundering Directive, rather saying that it was a failure of enforcement and an example of maladministration. We're actually checking this conclusion with our lawyers, and we will bring that information back because we think there are arguments to conclude that there has been a breach of obligations in the third Anti-Money Laundering Directive. So we will probably be bringing forward amendments along those lines. Another thing we find missing is a focus on maladministration by particular EU member states, and we feel we should name these states and do so without fear or favour. The reports, for example, the reports of the Maltese FIU concluding that there were suspicions of money laundering which haven't been followed up by the police. the implementation of the fourth anti-money laundering directive in Germany, which we find to be in breach of the EU text, and the issue of lack of cooperation in the past on the part of the Luxembourgish authorities to request to track tax evaders. Moving on to the recommendations, we will make some amendments to what we consider to be an extremely good basis. The recommendations reiterate how our lack of powers have hampered our investigations and call for the Parliament's rights of inquiry to be strengthened. We know that given how the Council was reluctant to engage with our PANA committee, nothing will happen if we count on the Member States to revise the treaty and give us some power. So we think we need to come up with innovative ways to strengthen our competence. The recommendations also have to address the main issue of the Panama Papers, which found that EU-based intermediaries are supporting tax avoidance using European financial status, and particularly the City of London, where more than half the companies were registered. For the sake of all European citizens, we have to propose unwinding this industry to the benefit of everybody, and in fact for global citizens, because it's the poorer countries of the world, as Jeppe pointed out, that lose the most. We want to see strong action on intermediaries, as has already been noted, but the market dominance of the big four accountancy firms has not been mentioned, and I would like to see stronger and more concrete proposals on that area and on the groupthink that really governs the whole area of accountancy and financial expertise, and what they refer to as tax planning. We will be bringing forward specific amendments in this area. In conclusion, I see there's no timer, but I've nearly finished.
Wir haben vergessen, die Uhr anzumachen, aber ich habe drauf.
Yes.
Then we believe that we should stand together and we should not defend particular national interests, because we're operating here for the basis of all Europeans and trying to ensure cooperation. I'm a Brit, as you know, but I know very well that what we found from the Panama Papers is that the British tax havens and the relationship between the City of London and the overseas territories is a key problem. I think we need a strong recommendation that says, A, that overseas territories should either become independent or should become part of the UK, and B, that these irregularities in the case of the UK should be resolved before any post-Brexit deal is agreed. I'd happily stand up to that recommendation. I hope you'll join me in that. So, thanks for the fun we had during the inquiry, and I look forward to discussing it further with you in the Shadows meetings.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Now, about your last point, we've heard in the UK that the laws apply across the board, but the British supervisory authorities are not controlling their territories. Good. Okay, Marco Valli for the EFDD next.
Grazie.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd also like to thank the two rapporteurs, because once again, excellent work has been done by the people leading this battle in the Parliament. Now, the problem is that I see many excellent recommendations, but there's an extra one that I think we should put in, namely that we respect the recommendations when the rules are established. This Parliament, in fact, was an example of it at the last plenary in terms of the tax transparency in the country-by-country reporting. And what was done, I think, is taking a step backwards because of the exclusion that was introduced for multinationals that have a seat outside the EU, and I think that's taking us on a step backwards. So we're working very hard, all these recommendations with Taxi 1, Taxi 2, PANA, and all the recommendations we make in ECON, but ultimately we are legislating in the wrong direction, watering these recommendations down, and I don't think that's the right approach. So I would like to have put in the report that there has to be country-by-country reporting, specifying certain elements that would make it more ambitious, rather than having the option, as has been adopted in the recent plenary. On the topic of sanctions, the countries on the blacklist in the report, the idea is to suspend equivalence for the third countries, but I think sanctions should be stricter, and I'll be tabling some amendments on that. And then on the list of the high-risk third countries, we think it's rather absurd that the Commission's list should not even include some of those jurisdictions in the Panama Papers. And I do think there we should be able to find some middle ground. We also think we should underline the need for a list of tax havens in the EU showing no tolerance. I think we've got to be strict, particularly where it's within our sovereignty, because otherwise we pay the price for that in terms of economic and social disasters and the imbalances flowing from these. We do, however, share the idea of the banks and the intermediaries that are showing non-cooperative behaviour and facilitating tax avoidance. We could even maybe withdraw the banking licence, and I would agree with that, because we think that the banks are the greatest intermediaries here. In fact, we need to do more, because the banks are part of EU legislation and they're the ones that circulate the money, and hence I think we need to be stricter with them. After all, they're within the EU's remit and the tax isn't. So I think we have to act where we can and take a very firm stance. And then strengthening the anti-money laundering legislation, we think it's absolutely essential to push for greatest transparency, extending to the trusts and all other companies public disclosure of ultimate UBOs, making no distinction between profit and non-profit. Also, we need to bring down the threshold for identification of the beneficial owners. On the difficulties we've had in PANA and the work that's been done, I think it's absolutely essential, as our colleague Molly from the Greens said, that a committee of inquiry should have true investigative powers. I think we need to put that into the report if possible. And then on the Code of Conduct group, it would be good to put in the report a proposal to have an in-depth assessment after 19 years of work that's been done. This evaluation should be independent and should be followed up by a radical overhaul of the Code of Conduct group. I think that would be a good idea. Now, I think this is a very good text. As usual, of course, we could have had more, but I do think what I said at the beginning is important, that the Parliament and the institutions should take the opportunity to move forward and should indeed show courage. I think what happened last week in the plenary with the vote simply gives more fuel to those working against us. And others I know are trying to work seriously on this report. So an additional recommendation would be to say that as soon as there's an opportunity, let's not miss it once again. Otherwise, we simply fuel the arguments of those wanting to go against the Parliament and the Commission. Thank you very much, Mr. Valli. You mentioned one thing where we have a conflict with the Commission. In other words, which tax havens within the EU should be on the list. I remember what the President of the Commission said, who said that, as far as he's concerned, only tax havens from outside the EU should figure on the list. I also don't think that's appropriate, so I'm sure we're going to run into a conflict. Next, Barbara Kappel for the INF. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to thank both rapporteurs for the draft. It's very comprehensive, balanced, and the right priorities have been set. During our mission to Cyprus, we saw this for ourselves, and everyone's waiting for this. In particular, in Cyprus, it was my impression that the member states, and in particular the stakeholders in the member states, the FIUs, for example, are very interested to see what's going to come from the Parliament. And once this report is concluded, I think it is going to deliver some very useful findings for the stakeholders of the Parliament, Commission and the Council, because the Parliament is putting a great deal of input into the fight against tax avoidance and everything connected with the Panama Papers publication, but also on the LuxLeaks beforehand. So there are high expectations. I think the draft report then that we have before us is certainly true to that expectation. In the conclusions, important points have been mentioned regarding the work that we did earlier in Taxe and then in PANA. In particular, the lack of cooperation that needs to be strengthened. We need far greater cooperation between the member states, better exchange of information, and if need be, we need sanctions if there are flagrant cases. Of course, we also need to strengthen and improve the Code of Conduct group, as we've heard quite rightly in the draft. In the past, there have been shortcomings which need to be improved, and I hope with a new leadership in the conduct group that can be improved. Now, I think there are a few areas that are a little bit too vague that need to be further clarified. For example, I'm still not entirely sure about the blacklist. I was present at Commissioner Jourova's hearing. The report talks about two different lists, a common EU list of non-cooperative jurisdictions and an EU anti-money laundering list for third countries. And I'm sure the latter is very important. However, we have to ensure there's cooperation with the Americans, the FATF, and that it's a proper list. It cannot simply be a list drawn up on the basis of the Commission's understanding here. That's certainly what I gleaned from what the Commissioner said. Now, the common EU list, I think we need to consider whether it's enough to draw up a list or whether we say that non-cooperative jurisdictions or member states, they need infringement proceedings. I don't think a list is sufficient. I think we should also come up with some other measures. Then the second point, exchange of information. Of course, this is very important. It's been criticised that, of course, the national regulatory authorities have insufficient resources, both in terms of staff and funding. That's right. However, we have to consider whether, with the increased information requirements that we have, we cannot further contribute to the lack of resources, in that so much information is passed on to these national authorities that they simply cannot deal with it. And then point 25, Luxembourg, Cyprus and the United States. So it's important to mention that. But I think on the basis of a mission to these countries, we've realized that these countries shouldn't all be treated as if they were the same. They need individual treatment. And on money laundering, of course, that's extremely important. And once again, the shortcomings of the blacklist, those that aren't mentioned, that's clear. It's important to mention those. The FIU net cooperation with Europol, I saw in Cyprus just how important that is, particularly in the Egmont group. That's a very important area, and that needs to be emphasised. Then another point with respect to the intermediaries, 113, that point. We could say that we require not only trusts that are important intermediaries that so far are not subject to any disclosure requirements. Maybe we need to push that and say that shadow banks in the future should also be more strongly regulated to create greater transparency. With respect to institutional cooperation, as I said before, the problems of the past have been mentioned. That's important, and I think that serves as an incentive for the member states to be more cooperative. Thank you very much, Mrs. Kappel. That completes the list of the shadows. Mr. Shambatsky still isn't here. So this now brings us on to the group speakers. First of all, the EPP, Tom van de Candelara.
Voorzitter, ik wil ook graag mijn appreciatie uitdrukken.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd also like to express my appreciation for the vigour of this committee, particularly the chair and the two co-rapporteurs, and I also welcome the report that's been tabled. It's really excellent basis for discussion. I'd like to repeat what the EPP shadow said, Mr. Niedermayer. With respect to the time frame, we've got to be clearer. I think we also need to make the text a bit clearer, take out everything that's already covered by legislation to make it more hard-hitting and more specific, to tighten it up. And I think that will make the report easier to communicate and more convincing. Then on the role of intermediaries, the wealth managers, and the need to have a very clear message, particularly when it comes to sanctions. Everything's been said, so I don't need to add anything there. There are just 3 minor points I'd like to flag up, and these are the following. First of all, the anti-money laundering regulatory framework. Here we have to ensure effective, consistent application. The report often talks about proper implementation, the term proper. I think we need to emphasize the idea of consistency or coherence. I do think we also need the word consistent, not just proper, particularly when it comes to using the right terminology. Secondly, exchange of information between financial intelligence units and the creation of the European level FIU. Now that's a very ambitious proposal, but it shouldn't detract from what already exists today. I hope, therefore, we can stress the fact that we need far more resources for the national FIUs, because it's only that way that it will be possible to have exchanges between these units. And then in the report, there's a lot of stress placed on exchange of information in connection with the DAC, particularly when it comes to implementation. But here again, I think we need to be bold enough to say that national authorities need the necessary resources to allow for real exchange of information. So there we have it. I hope you can accept my comments, and I'm very keen to continue the work, particularly discussing the compromises. Thank you, Tom. Next, Ellie Schlein for the S&D. 2 minutes per speaker, please.
Many thanks to Jeppe and Peter for your work and for this draft report. For my part, I am pleased to see that a specific part concerning the international dimension, and in particular developing countries, is present. As we have seen, these countries are the most hit by tax dodging, and for a global plague, we need global solutions. As Zuckman told us, international rules are most effective when they are of universal application. Establishing global tax norms should not be an exclusive project, as the BEPS process turned out to be. Defining and updating global tax norms should be a process managed by a universal, democratic, UN intergovernmental tax body. Further, while OECD rules officially bind only OECD member states, non-OECD countries are often pressured to adopt them, even where they are not favourable to them or they lack the adequate human and financial resources to cope with rules and tax evasion phenomena. Even most developed nations struggle to cope with. I mean, it's difficult for some of these countries. Emblematic is the case of the OECD Common Reporting Standard requiring a country to participate reciprocally. This can be problematic for developing countries that do not have the capacity to compile the information. Support in terms of finance, technical expertise and time is needed to allow them to build the required capacity, and the Common Reporting Standard should include a transition period for them, as the Parliament asked for in its resolution of July 2015 on these matters. There is an important reference to the EU list of non-cooperative jurisdiction, keeping in mind that specific challenges developing countries face should be taken into account. It would be completely unfair to include a country like Liberia and not include some of the United States, for example, or not creating a scrutiny mechanism for EU member states. And then it's very important to have spillover effect analysis of EU and member state tax policies, because including the matter of tax treaties which can be improperly used by multinationals to take away important amount of resources. So let's not forget, this is not only about the EU. The huge amount of money lost by developing countries every year through tax evasion harms and risks to make our development policies useless, and we need a global and development perspective on these crucial issues. So I will present some amendments, but thanks a lot for your very good work.
Thank you very much, Ellie Schlein. The next one is for the ECR, Pirkko Ruohonen-Lerner.
Kiitos puheenjohtaja.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much to the rapporteurs for the thorough and detailed work that's gone into this report. It, I think, summarizes very well the discussions of the committee. Now, there are a number of comments I'd have to make to improve the reports. 2.4, for instance, has a list of countries, or 2.2 rather. We need to use that list far more broadly in EU work on this. 2.1, we need to improve EU standards to bring it up to FATF standards. We need to have greater policy coherence on these issues, particularly in EU relations with other countries. We don't need to just have tunnel vision about exclusively tax havens. I think we also need to consider ways we continue the committee's work in the futures. What kind of initiatives could we start over the next, say, 5-year periods? I don't have pat answers for this, but I think these issues should be considered by everyone. I think if attention on these issues diminishes, then I think the legislative initiatives will lose momentum. I think we also need to further consider the role of journalists and whistleblowers in this political agenda. I'd furthermore draw attention to the importance of the international community and international researchers on this. I've looked through the report very carefully. We also need to take a close look at the statistics. There are some judgments which I would prefer to remove because I would call them into questions. Thanks once again to our rapporteurs for doing such an excellent job.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Pirko. Next up, Maite Pagasurtundua.
Ich habe lange geübt.
Presidente,
I practiced for a long time.
enhorabuena. It was excellent, Chairman. And what's also been excellent has been the work, I think, that's been done by our rapporteurs. I think that the work they've done, as I said, is excellent, and thanks to that now we can move on to tabling amendments, and I think we will get an excellent basis. And thank you too to the Secretariat. And we shouldn't forget why this committee was set up, what it's trying to achieve, which is to influence the Commission and Council, which haven't been that cooperative with us. And it's our obligation too to come up with a political response for the citizens of Europe who are waiting for that. And they are waiting for there not to be a systemic and systematic possibility of having tax avoidance and evasion and all the crimes that go with them. I think one of the main things that we've had through the PANA committee that's been achieved is for us to have a general overview of what's lacking in the system. And I think that what has been said was quite right. Not everybody involved in the system has been responsible for what's happened, but the directives haven't been properly transposed, and each supervisory body and each link in the chain, political and institution, hasn't all necessarily done what it should have done. And with an overview, we know that's the case, and that should mean that in future we can prevent parallel systems in parallel countries taking up so much time and effort going into this kind of phenomenon, and thus depriving the public of the kind of money that's needed to actually implement other policies. I think that our policy now is also clear on sanctions, and progress is being made in ensuring that they will be used properly. There are intermediaries, banks, for example. We want to ensure that they don't want to repeat what's happened in the past in any way. And the change in perspective, if we do set up a new EU tax coordination and coherence centre, would be an excellent idea, because everything that we have learnt, all the recommendations we'll be putting forward, will hopefully therefore be used will be fruitful in the future. Of course, we've seen the problems that the FIUs have had, the shortcomings there, both in their operations and in legislation. And if we don't have exchange of information, we won't be able to achieve what we want to, and the goal will slip through our fingers as it currently is. I think that what happened... Yes, we also need an independent agency, I think, for whistleblowers to be able to get in touch with, and I'm afraid I've run out of time.
Für die GUE, Fabio.
Fabio Di Masi for the GUE.
Bitte.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thanks very much to Jeppe Kofod and to Peter Jezek for their excellent work and drafts. We've got the 90 minutes are up, and now it's on to penalties. We need to work together as a team because this is the decisive phase of the match. It's the decisive phase where we determine what happens with this work. How can this be turned into policies? I'll restrict myself to a very few points. Insufficient cooperation from member states and the Council. I think we need to point at the directives which have been blocked by Council and Commission and see if we can't extend our competences. We shouldn't just be able to invite along witnesses. I think we should also be able to hear them under oath with possible consequences if they do not tell the truth. As for the money laundering legislation, there is an ongoing trilogue. I'm participating in the trilogue myself, and here I think we close the loopholes for bogus directors. That's something that came up. We need to have proper registration of the ultimate beneficiary owner. We need to do something about the owners of letterbox companies. We can't have the loophole of non-profit trust either. Thirdly, we must finally ensure that the predicate offence is clearly defined, and we must ensure that prosecutors can operate cross borders. And of course, we must leave aside minor crimes of mistakes in tax declaration. On the CCCTB, that's also an important point. That's crucial. Now, for the CCCTB. The crucial issue is whether we've got an increase in the tax take from the company. On the blacklist of tax havens, the zero tax should be a criteria for being on that list. Absolutely, we should have EU states, but we need specific measures to, for instance, do away with double taxation rules. All the measures that are being discussed by member states and which were proposed by Maltese presidency, such as tax at source, would only be, or rather for withholding tax. Many of these countries are saying that we don't want any tax sanctions for the tax havens. On this, we need clarity. Finally, as a group, we've come forward with a study on enablers. And so that includes proposals on things like ring fencing, the question of EU licensing, tax advisors, and then there's the whole question of insufficient information sharing on terrorism financing. I recall a Europol report on this. I mean, this is something which I think very many people are concerned about. Thanks, Fabio. And now for the Greens, Heidi Hautala.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to join the thanks to the rapporteurs and to the Secretariat for this very impressive work. And I will add a couple of remarks to what Molly Scott-Cato has already said. On access to information, I think we came across once again with this interinstitutional problem that we have with the Council, and this is reflected well in the report. The Council seriously hampered the work of this committee by refusing to provide us with any relevant information. And then what about the European Commission? some access was granted in a secure room only, but without any possibility to reflect what we have learned outside this Parliament and even outside the secure room. And I think this has to change. We have two questions here. How are we going to deal with the documents that have been provided to the committee as an immediate question? And secondly, how should we ensure that the European Parliament has access to adequate information from other institutions so that the Parliament can perform its role as a watchdog? Now, of course, it also has to do with transparency and access to information to the general public as well, not only to the Parliament as an institution. And we have to defend the public's rights. And may I just point out that at the same time as we call for ambitious public country-by-country reporting, which would allow the citizens to have access to information, we actually did restrict this freedom remarkably last week in the vote in the plenary. And this is something that I believe that we have to keep in mind. We cannot be hypocritical about ourselves in such a situation. Maybe this can still be at one point corrected.
Vielen Dank, Heidi.
Thank you, Heidi. On now for EPP, Nuno Melo, and then three catch the eyes: Ana Gomes, Ramon Jauregui, and Louis Michel, and Thomas Mann, and Michael Teurer.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that it's important to underline the fact that for Parliament it's very important that the report be based on facts rather than ideas that cannot be proven. It would be very easy, I think, to fall into the trap of speculating, but if the report is to live up to our expectations, the report, I think, has to be based on facts, on what's been proven, and specify what hasn't been proven. And we therefore feel that if the report can then be used in our political battle, we would be doing a good job in the Parliament. And then we have to take into account the specific mandate of the Committee of Inquiry. We have a goal, and that goal does set the parameters for our task, and we have to be capable of writing our report to shape and to reflect that goal. And I think that there could be a temptation to mention the Commission for other purposes. Having said that, I think it's also very important for us to highlight who cooperated and who could have done so but didn't. And in particular, therefore, who refused to provide information. And if you look at the press and the coverage there of what the Commission has been done, there were various people that were quoted having actually spoken to the Commission and then refused us information. And I'm just making this point so that we can remember in the future. And I think that Parliament should in fact make it clear who did cooperate and who didn't cooperate, and that is a point that should be borne in mind.
Das wird ohnehin ergänzt.
Yes, I think that's going to be added. We will list who we met, we'll name names. Catch the eye now. Ana Gomes.
I'd like to greet the rapporteurs and the secretariat to work with the rapporteurs for sure, but they did really a very good work, easy to read, will be definitely a very significant piece produced by this Parliament. I believe that on top of all the other objectives, there is an influence that we can have at short term with this report. We should not lose track of that, and that is influencing the outcome of the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, in which we are working at the moment, which we could not close with the Maltese presidency, but we hope we can close it with the Estonian presidency. And I'm pretty sure that when we look at this report, the recommendations, they should inform, and a number of us who are in both fora could actually ensure that indeed this is reflected. I think this is particularly important because we need to step up the fact that when we are fighting, it's not just about transparency and equity in taxation, it's also about indeed fighting money laundering, fighting the organized crime behind money laundering, including terrorism. And this is something that our member states often lose track. We just were blocked in the 5th anti-money laundering talks with Malta because some of our member states could not agree on including trusts in the type of entities for which we want transparency of the ultimate beneficiary owners. I think it's also very important in this respect that indeed the chapter, as it was suggested, that the chapter on facilitators, enablers, indeed the question of sanctions would be even strengthened. I think it's really essential, especially when we know, when we realize, as we did, that the whole system of anti-money laundering is built upon the perception or the premises that there are obliged entities. And here we are, through this work, coming to the conclusion that most of the entities, namely if you exclude the banks and the financial institutions, do not feel obliged at all. They don't comply at all. Then secondly, I think indeed maladministration by member states, as it was proposed by Molly Scott Cato, is really important, and that should be reflected in the text, but in particular in the annexes that should indeed reflect all the work we have done, including the missions. And I think that in the case of my country, it's one of them that really needs that there. Finally, follow up. It's important to have the chapter on the powers of the inquiry committees that the rapporteurs have put there. But I think we actually need to go further than that. We need to find out and to point out to some mechanism of follow-up, because we know that by existing and by meeting, we are interacting with a lot of people who are doing fantastic work, namely whistleblowers, and we are putting enormous pressure on the Commission and Member States to act.
Gut, vielen Dank. Ich darf noch mal erinnern, dass wir...
Thanks very much. We'd agreed on 2 minutes. Ramon Jauregui for the S&D.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I also too would like to thank the rapporteurs for their report and have a couple of brief comments. Firstly, on the philosophy behind the document, I think we should be ambitious too. We're not drawing up a legislative report. We're setting out a roadmap which will have a lot of repercussions, and it will take a long time for these ideas to be fully rolled out. But a lot of people are waiting for that, and I think therefore it's better for the report to be ambitious rather than to limit those ambitions. Secondly, what's lacking, I think, is a reference to an international body that will carry on with this work on tax evasion and avoidance. Things can't end here. I think we need to call on an international body and an international committee of experts in the UN or from the IMF. But I think that we should be asking for an international body to give continuity to this work, so that we don't have tax 1, tax 2, Panama Papers and nothing after that, and avoid. Thirdly, the European Commission does have more powers, more competence. If anything has become clear to the Committee of Inquiry, it's that we have a European Committee of Inquiry without legal possibilities for getting involved. And I think a recommendation, even suggesting changing the treaties if necessary, so that the European Commission has a fiscal coordination role and can work at international level on this area, is something that should be addressed. Another point that I think it's important for us to do is to have more specific idea of what unfair competition means as a concept, because this is a principle that hides fiscal behaviour which is harmful amongst member states. I think that the report should specify exactly what fair and unfair competition are more. Finally, Chairman, the Chairman knows I'm rapporteur in AFCO for the report on committees of inquiry. The experience with this committee is therefore important because we actually block the report to ensure that Parliament actually would be able to do a worthy job. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, we'll come back to the last point you raised, most definitely. Last up, Louis Michel on behalf of the ALDE.
Yes, firstly, congratulations to the rapporteurs and the Secretariat. I wanted to say that the most important point to me isn't the report, it's what's going to be included in the recommendations, which I think is the most vital part and really is the whole objective of our work. A brief point in passing, I draw a distinction between cooperation that we've had with the Commission vis-à-vis Council. Commission was, I think, much more helpful and much more open to a frank contribution to us, and Council was very different. I agree with our colleague Miller. We have to work on our mandate, within our mandate, and nothing other than that, rather than dissipating our efforts on useful things. We have to look at sanctions, intermediaries, and so on and so forth, and see what can be done in the recommendations without changing the treaties, because that can't be done immediately. That is something the member states would be responsible for and would have to look into. And for that, would need a change of the treaties. I'd be in favour, Chairman, of a maximum and minimum rate. I don't agree when we say we need a minimum rate. If you want a minimum rate, you also need a maximum rate, because if not, I imagine what the ideologists could do with that immediately. Final point, I am not in favour of us running to set up new control agencies. I think we first need to see what instruments we have that need to be improved, whose mandate perhaps needs to be extended, and what we can do with what already exists, rather than immediately trying to set up a whole series of other layers which would take up a lot of resources, take up a lot of time to be put in place, when we could actually put that into what we already have, because we do need control mechanisms, and that would be the easiest way of getting them.
Yes, on the what you say about taxes, that's quite stimulating, but unfortunately it doesn't time with reality. I remember being rapporteur on VAT, that the lowest figure was 15%. We allowed exceptions, and for the highest level, that failed. These are issues that require intensive discussion, Mr. Michel. That's just my opinion. Mr. Mann. Well, it's just praise being heaped on the rapporteurs, and I can only join in with the praise. You've really given us an excellent basis for further work. You've made it really clear why we need a committee of inquiry, not some kind of funny special committee. It means we've produced more quality work. Secondly, I think when you travel, you learn a lot. Your trips were most instructive. We found out things on the ground. We were a bit cheeky at times. I think so sometimes we ask questions that people didn't like, and that's quite right. As for the committee of inquiry falling or not being paid attention to the countries, that's been a problem. Anna, you mentioned the anti-money laundering directive. We've got to do something. We've got to contribute to it. We need a list of the tax havens, not just a white list, and we need a black list, which said these countries haven't done their jobs. I would like to get more up from the black list. I think we also need to consider what kind of sanctions we can apply. Above all, we've got to ensure we tackle the money laundering, but not just outside the EU, within the EU too. And that's why the Commission has to deliver. They were more constructive than we expected, fair enough. I mean, suggesting that we're going to bring about treaty changes, well, that's just going to take too long. I think what you've done is really good. Well done. And if we have some sensible amendments on board, I think we'll be able to show that this committee of inquiry really made a substantial contribution. Thank you, Mr. Mann. Next up, Michael Tora. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, my warmest thanks to the two rapporteurs. The report is really very good and builds on the results on Tax 1, Tax 2, the two special committees. And I can certainly agree with the last speaker, my highly esteemed colleague. A committee of inquiry should and does have different rights to a special committee, such as invited on guests in Tax 1 and Tax 2. We wanted to invite Marius Cole from Luxembourg and to quiz them here in the European Parliament. To date, we haven't managed to get him here. He played a major role in the tax rulings in Luxembourg, but we haven't managed to interrogate him in the European Parliament. So I take note of the fact that the recommendations made by Tax 1 and Tax 2 have not been followed. We requested documents. Nothing's been happened about this. I was very much in favour of establishing this committee of inquiry, but I don't think we shouldn't be calling into question what the special committees do, Tax 1 and 2, in scale and scope. They looked at systemic issues. There were certain limitations, of course, because on certain points we made no progress or were unable to, and we hoped that this committee of inquiry would allow us to make progress where we were unable to in the other committees. We didn't get as far as we would have liked. It took quite a long time before we managed to hear from the Commission President. Have we managed to investigate who is really responsible for all of this? In political terms, we heard the head Maltese ministers. If Maltese ministers are mentioned in conjunction with the Panama Papers, then I think the matter has to be looked into very carefully. Not all information was made available despite a fact-finding trip to Malta. The Financial Intelligence Analysis Unit produced a report which we couldn't take a look at. Many colleagues, including the rapporteurs, have made very clear that the question of European committees of inquiry have to put in the agenda. I think there are grounds for treaty changes here. We need the support of national parliaments. We are at a disadvantage because we don't get the support of national parliaments. So to sum up, there aren't just gaps in legislation, there are problems with implementations. There are 14 countries that support a European prosecutor, and I also think we need a European FBI. Thanks very much, Mr. Tora. It's not a question of passing judgment on who did better work. This has been repeatedly discussed and agreed that the competences of a committee of inquiry are insufficient. As for the Luxembourgers, we want to invite along Marius Cole and others. I'm calling them colleagues. I don't know if we can, but they continue to refuse. The Council made recommendations to the effect that discretion was the better part of valour. And I think we agree that the rules governing committees of inquiry need to be changed. I don't think we need pass judgment, but it's fair enough to make some of these remarks. Mr. Lopez Aguilar to speak next.
Presidente, con toda...
Thank you, Chairman. Very briefly, I do have a comment that I would like to make that is similar to some already made. Firstly, thanking the co-rapporteurs for the draft recommendation. It's a very important link in the work being done by the Committee of Inquiry. starting with the fact that it calls on us to recognise on a written basis, which will be very useful, all of the constraints on and limits of a committee of inquiry of the European Parliament. Sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between a study group, but if you look at the hearings that we've had and the witnesses that we've heard from during the committee of inquiry, it's very important that we actually put into writing the lessons we've learnt so that we can have a European strategy to combat tax havens, tax avoidance and tax evasion, and that we actually ensure that we are trying to achieve a very specific goal, because if we don't do that, we may seem to be trivializing predicate offences and tax havens, and actually if we don't mention the situations that one could criticise in the EU, such as free ports. And I think that what we don't want to have with the European strategy is a situation where massive tax avoidance isn't dealt with, the tax avoidance that was made so clear by the Panama leaks. And then we've also got the non-cooperative jurisdictions, some of which are actually linked to the member states that are members of the European Union, and notably the overseas territories of the UK or some of the Caribbean islands that are linked to the Netherlands in their defence and foreign affairs. But we do have to be very careful that we have a specific objective, and that mustn't be diluted or moved away from. We could inspire the Commission to take legislative action to then ensure that, as far as possible under the treaties, the fiscal competencies of the European Union are harnessed to avoid predatory tax behaviour and tax rulings in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our discussion, as far as I can see. I would like to give each co-rapporteur 5 minutes. Kofod, you're first.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much to colleagues, shadows, and other colleagues for the, I think, very, very good comments. Many good, also concrete proposals that we, of course, as co-rapporteurs will of course, work with. And also the way you received the report. First of all, I think it's right, if I could comment briefly on some issues, the nature of our committee, of the PANA committee. It's true, many of you have said it, we are an inquiry committee on paper, but our formal powers is very limited, as we know, and I think we also try to recognize that in the report and coming up with recommendations that has to be followed up by other committees, but also by the Parliament and EU institutions as a whole. That's very clear. But the nature of our work, I mean, based on the biggest leak in history, on the Panama Papers, we had this rare insight on how these structures were set up for tax evasion, money laundering, terrorist finance, all type of criminal activities. And I think we also saw clearly, and we document that EU intermediaries, big part of facilitating that. It was mentioned that the UK overseas territories is very involved. True, and we state that very clearly. And I think we have a big responsibility to act on these very important findings. So the nature of our work is to reveal, support, and build up a case for action. Also the purpose. It was mentioned by many of you that we need to show our citizens, our member states, the Commission, that there is actually a need to act on these issues. If I go down to some concrete issues which was mentioned, first of all, I must say throughout our work that I find it very, very evident that intermediaries, lawyers, wealth managers, tax advisors, and so on, the ones who are self-regulating, they basically fail their reporting obligations, and we need to act on this. So that's why it's very much here. On the timeline, it was mentioned by Niedermayer, on the timeline and vis-à-vis the legislation, it's true, but we're looking at the Panama Papers, so of course there's different times when different laws applied, but I have to say, in general, the general findings is that when there is secrecy, when there is a lack of reporting, a lack of responsibility, whether it's intermediaries, member states, then we see that these things can go on. So one of the, I think, if you look in our recommendations, one of the overall recommendations is transparency, yeah? And also sincere cooperation is important. So I have to say that on the timeline we would like to look at this, but I think it's important that we also fight for transparency. On many of, then there's the external and internal dimension. I agree. In EU we have a lot of loopholes when it comes to tax evasion and tax avoidance. Free ports was mentioned. We have investigated that very carefully, and I think we should close our loopholes with our legislation. And it's a big task for the Commission and Member States to take up. And we also expect the Commissions to come forward with legislation that can close the loopholes within EU. When it comes to third countries, the list, both of non-cooperative tax jurisdictions, but also on high-risk countries, these lists has to be credible, and it also has to be with sanctions if countries and jurisdictions are not following up the standards that we agreed upon. On beneficial ownership, it was also mentioned, very important theme, also revealed in the Panama Papers. And there, of course, some progress has been made. We're discussing AMLD 5 and so on, but we need real EU-level action when it comes to beneficial ownership. The Code of Conduct Group for Business Taxation, it's mentioned actually, some of you mentioned it. It's mentioned that we need a comprehensive evaluation of the work of the Code of Conduct Group for Business Taxation. It's been existing for 19 years now, and it's supposed to phase out cross-border harmful tax regimes within EU, between member states. But you know how it is. They work in secrecy mainly, and they work in unanimity. So it's been very difficult. And I really want the Commission also to start this sincere evaluation. They can do that. They have the power to do that. And they should do it. And then the conclusions, I'm sure, will support more transparency and a fundamental reform of the Code of Conduct Group for Business Taxation. Then I have to say there was a lot mentioned about the current legislation and also initiatives that our report has to support, that we are ambitious on. I agree very much on that. So when we talk about the CCCTB, for example, or other initiatives, we need to show that there's a link with our findings and the need for action. But it was also mentioned by Ramon and others that I think because we are not a legislative, it's not a legislative report, it's an inquiry report, or it's important that we show ambition and defining, what type of legal framework could be suitable in the 21st century when it comes to fighting money laundering and tax evasion. And the framework we have today is not sufficient. The responsible actors to implement the framework are not doing a proper job all the way around. So we need to change that course. I want to stop here, Chair, because I know we are running out of time. But I want to say to you all, thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments, and I've noted everything. And we look forward to working on amendments and improvements of the reports together. I think we can produce a very good product if we work together. Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, Jeppe.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Well, there is not much to add to that. But I'd like also to thank to everyone every colleagues for their comments, especially for the positive ones, but not only for those. And I would perhaps reiterate our approach. We, of course, did not want to approach the issue in a sort of ideological way. The conclusions are based on the findings of the committee, on our joint work, and the recommendation or the conclusions are then reflected in the recommendations. So I would hope, and the discussion gives me that hope, that also amendments will be based on this approach, that they will be substantiated by the findings of the committee. Because only if our final report is reliable and well justified, it can be taken seriously, and it can improve the future work of such committees, inquiry committees of the European Parliament. Well, I'd like to thank the Secretariat because it's been doing a very good job although understaffed. I don't consider this maladministration in this case. It's simply the state of the right of inquiry in the European Parliament in the beginning of this millennium. So hopefully this report will contribute at the end not only to the fight against money laundering, tax avoidance and tax evasion, but also to improve the right of inquiry of the Parliament as such. Thank you very much to everyone.
Ja, vielen Dank an
Thank you very much to everyone who's contributed today. In particular, thank you to both rapporteurs. I think that this is an excellent start for the rest of our work. The deadline for amendments is the 5th of September, midday. It's a Tuesday. Before that, we'll have had a committee week to give us more opportunity to look at the different amendments and the reports. Well, we can already start our work now also through the summer. So thank you very much to both rapporteurs, to the Secretariat, to the excellent preparation. And can I highlight that tomorrow at 2 o'clock we're going to have 4 ministers present, so I'd be very grateful if there is a good turnout. I know we've got committee meetings tomorrow and votes. The 4 ministers from Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands and Italy. I think that's a very good basis and to discuss progression both in the EU and abroad. After that, we've got a break. After tabling the amendments, we'll have a public meeting on Tuesday.